The room held nothing but the sound of heavy curtains muffling the city noise. Mark Cuban and Donald Trump stood across from each other, a thick stack of documents anchored to the table between them. 6 months ago, the screens of millions were filled with their public insults. A digital war fought over the future of healthcare policy. Today, those same screens would see only a grip of hands. The handshake was firm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of warmth. They did not linger. As hands parted, Cuban pulled a single folder from his briefcase, sliding it across the polished surface. Trump leaned forward, his gaze tracking the movement of the paper as it settled against the pile. There was no pretense of friendship here. The political noise of the past half year had been stripped away, replaced by the weight of a multi-billion-dollar shift. The document on the table was not a policy proposal. It was a blueprint for a total market bypass. They stared at the ledger, not each other, fully aware that the quiet in the room was the sound of a structural change finally taking root in the sector. The document on the table represented a $65 billion fracture in the American healthcare system. Cuban tapped the paper, his finger tracing a line through the complex web of inflated costs. This was not about public opinion or voter sentiment. It was about the opaque pricing structures that had allowed intermediaries to sit between the manufacturer and the patient for decades. Every time a medication changed hands, a hidden fee was added, a slice taken by a middleman who provided no tangible health benefit. This was the inefficiency gap. It had grown into a $65 billion monster, siphoning wealth from the average patient while medical costs spiraled beyond reach. The current pharmacy benefit manager system relied on this complexity to survive. It thrived on the lack of transparency, counting on the fact that prices were rarely questioned at the pharmacy counter. Both men understood that this system was not merely broken, it was a structural parasite on the entire market. To dismantle it required more than just policy adjustments. It required a complete bypass of the traditional supply chain. They stood in the quiet of the room, looking at the numbers, identifying the exact point where they would begin to cut the fat from the ledger. Cuban flipped open the folder. Inside lay a list of essential generic medications, printed on standard white paper. He placed a pen on the table, pointing to the first dozen entries. These were the high-volume drugs, the ones that drained patient bank accounts every single month. Trump pulled the document toward him, scanning the names with a sharp, rhythmic tapping of his finger against the table. He paused at the third item, shook his head, and circled a different name further down the page. "This one moves faster," he said, his voice low and focused. "Prioritize the insulin variants first, then the antibiotics." Cuban nodded, acknowledging the tactical logic. They spent the next several minutes negotiating the sequence of the rollout. It was a cold, pragmatic exchange. They were not debating healthcare ideology or social impact. They were debating the speed of market penetration. Trump marked 5 items for immediate priority shipping, his pen pressing hard enough to leave indentations on the wood beneath the paper. Every checkmark on that list represented a direct attack on the profit margins of legacy providers. The folder now contained their operational strategy. With the priorities set, the theoretical phase ended, and the logistical campaign began. Cuban did not wait for the ink to dry on the priority list. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb moving across the screen with practiced speed. He dialed his primary distribution center, his gaze fixed on the wall map. "We are taking the direct route," he stated, his voice devoid of hesitation. The manager on the other end began to cite standard bureaucratic lanes, mentioning the usual protocols for inventory clearance. Cuban cut him off. "Cancel the standard routing. Divert the entire shipment from the regional hub directly to the independent pharmacies. If the software flags it as an error, bypass the verification gate." The line crackled with static as the instructions were logged. A warning alert appeared on the digital interface at the facility, signaling a violation of the traditional supply chain sequence. Cuban watched the screen in real time, his finger hovering over the authorization key. He pressed it, overriding the security protocol that had protected the incumbent market giants for years. The status bar changed, from pending to authorized. The inventory was no longer moving through the pre-approved channels. It was now in the wild, headed straight for the consumer. The bypass was complete, and the established middlemen were now officially out of the loop. Trump stood and walked to the window, his phone pressed against his ear. He was not calling a subordinate. He was dialing a direct line into the Federal Regulatory Office. "I want those pending batches cleared by the end of the business day," he said, his tone leaving no room for counter-argument. On the other end, a voice attempted to cite the standard 90-day review period required for new distribution protocols. Trump stopped him mid-sentence. "We are not talking about a 90-day review. We are talking about a structural market adjustment that happens now." He named a specific administrator, a contact he had cultivated over years of deal-making. The tension in the room spiked as the official hesitated. Trump leaned against the glass, watching the street below, counting the seconds. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited. The silence stretched until the official finally conceded, promising to override the standard procedural queue. Trump hung up the phone and looked back at the desk. The approval documents were already shifting in the digital queue, moving from stalled to active. The administrative shield that had protected the incumbents for decades was collapsing. With the regulatory gate thrown wide open, the path for the generic medications was clear. The market giants had lost their primary weapon: time. The triumph of the regulatory approval was short-lived. Before the ink could set on the new approval logs, the heavy oak doors of the room pushed open. A man in a standard suit entered, carrying a thick, bound document folder. He did not speak, but placed the file on the table between the two men. It was a formal injunction from the Legacy Healthcare Coalition. The text argued that the partnership created immediate market instability and irreparable harm to existing supply chain contracts. Cuban scanned the first page, his jaw tightening as he read the list of claims. The injunction was designed to freeze all distribution, locking the generic shipments in the warehouse until a court hearing could be scheduled. Trump stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he flipped through the pages of the filing. This was not a minor administrative hurdle. It was a full-scale legal assault intended to drain their resources and burn through their momentum. The silence in the room returned, but it was no longer the silence of progress. It was the heavy, static air of a standoff. Outside, the market giants were already signaling their intent to leverage every possible court to block the project. The partnership had been moving at high speed, but now they were staring at a brick wall of litigation. The strategy had to change, and it had to change instantly. Cuban did not look at the injunction as a defeat. He looked at it as a map of the opposition's desperation. He pulled a fresh notepad from the table, his pen hovering for only a fraction of a second before he began to write. The injunction relied on a specific claim of regional exclusivity that had already been rendered void by the federal approval. He pointed to the clause, his finger tapping the paper with rhythmic, sharp force. "They filed this in the wrong district," he said. "It is a procedural error. We do not stop, we override." He pulled a stack of legal forms from his briefcase and began drafting a counter-affidavit. The sound of his pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. He moved with a precision that bordered on violence, filling lines, checking references, and stacking pages. He finished the final page and shoved the document across the table toward the notary. He did not wait for the ink to dry. He grabbed his own pen, pressed the nib into the paper, and signed his name with a single, continuous motion that tore slightly through the fiber of the page. The injunction was not just being answered. It was being dismantled in real time. He looked up, his eyes locked on the door. The legal stall had failed. The legal battle was merely the opening salvo. Trump stood, adjusted his tie, and strode toward the waiting cameras in the adjacent hallway. He did not look back at the desk or the stack of legal filings. This was no longer a matter of courtrooms or procedural technicalities. He stepped onto the dais, the flashbulbs erupting in a rhythmic, blinding sequence. He tapped the microphone. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp and commanding. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on the lens, and began to speak. He did not mention the injunction. Instead, he painted a picture of a system that had forgotten the people it was meant to serve. He called out the legacy providers by name, labeling their legal maneuvers as a direct attack on the household budget of every voter. He framed the partnership not as a business deal, but as a crusade against inflated costs. The room was silent, save for the hum of broadcast equipment and the frantic scribbling of reporters. He raised his hand, gesturing toward the screen behind him, which displayed the price of essential drugs. He was turning the public into an unstoppable force, a shield that no injunction could pierce. The opposition was no longer just fighting two men. They were now fighting the tide of public opinion. While the cameras were still flashing, the real work shifted to the logistics hub. A heavy metal gate rolled upward with a screech of rusted chain. The first fleet of transport trucks idled in the bay, engines humming in a low, rhythmic vibration that shook the concrete floor. A foreman signaled with a raised hand. The lead truck lurched forward, tires gripping the asphalt, and cleared the warehouse perimeter. This was the point of no return. The inventory was officially in motion, bypassing the entrenched distribution lanes that had dominated the sector for decades. Within minutes, the data hit the exchange. On the trading floor, screens that had been steady for years began to flicker with red. The numbers ticked downward in rapid, stuttering increments. Traditional intermediaries, caught off guard by the sudden influx of low-cost supply, watched their valuations erode, 4%, then more. The market was not just reacting to the news, it was recoiling from the structural shift. The logic of the old pricing model was being dismantled by the simple, relentless movement of cargo. As the trucks accelerated onto the highway, the financial giants realized their dominance had reached its expiration date. The disruption was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an active, irreversible reality. Back in the quiet of the private office, the screens were still cycling through the fallout. The numbers continued their slow, steady descent. Cuban stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the ticker tape reflect against the glass. Trump sat at the desk, tapping a pen against the edge of a printed report. Neither man spoke. There was no need for celebration or handshakes. The objective was the ledger, and the ledger was finally moving in their direction. They exchanged a brief, sharp glance, the kind shared by two people who had just dismantled a wall they both knew needed to fall. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was a cold recognition of a task completed. The $65 billion inefficiency was being bled out of the system in real time. They had used the levers of influence and logistics to force a new reality, and the sector was struggling to adapt. The traditional model of drug pricing, once thought immovable, was losing its grip. The room felt heavy with the weight of the change they had set in motion. They turned their attention back to the data, watching the final lines of the old system fade away, replaced by a new, brutal efficiency.